everyone, welcome back to my channel. So for this vlog, I'm gonna address one of the questions that I received in the comment. Talk about the movies that first inspired you to go into horror. I'm just gonna dive right in and try to keep it short and concise because I'm known to go off tangent and ramble a lot. So sorry in advance if I do. If I just answered a question, it would be Poltergeist 3. Then without context, people would be like, wait, what? Poltergeist 3? I'm very aware of the stigma this film has, and I know this is not necessarily a film that people mention as being particularly good, but hey, it's the reality for me. The first horror film I ever saw on TV was Poltergeist 3. When I was a kid, my grandma would babysit me at my parents' place, and we had cable and we had the Canadian equivalent of HBO that would just like play movies all day long. So when I'd come home from kindergarten, I would like constantly like be watching a movie. And since I was a fairly mature kid, and my grandma was really into like mystery and suspense and thrillers, my parents would like let me watch pretty much anything as long as like my grandma was like, okay, this is okay. She was kind of like the judge of like what was passable or not in terms of like film on TV. I have her to thank also for my love of like anything that's more in the thriller and suspense realm, because that's the kind of stuff that she would watch and I would like sneak a peek at it. And then when she'd see that I was not scared, she'd just like let me watch more and more, and there you go. And then that's how I developed. That was the first genre I ever loved. One afternoon, I was just like watching a movie as usual, and I remember like she was like ironing clothes, because that's what she would do in her afternoon, just like watch a movie and iron clothes. But I stumbled upon this film, and I remember when I saw this, like obviously because there was no DVR back then, you just like flip the channel and then like boom, you could like start watching something straight in the middle of it, and like you had no idea like what the beginning was, but like I would just like keep watching anyways. And I remember being fascinated, like utterly fascinated by this movie, because there was this little girl who would like enter puddles and disappear into mirrors, and like, you know, just somehow like cross over like other as portals to like other dimensions. And I remember, how cool is this? Like that was the coolest thing I had ever seen on TV. My child's mind was blown. I was like, I want to see more of this. Like, you know, what is this? Like I had no idea this kind of stuff was even conceivable. So I became obsessed with that idea of like, okay, I want to know what that movie about the little girl, like, you know, entering puddle is, you know? And through research, I finally found out that it was Poltergeist 3, and then I realized, I'm like, oh, I just watched my first horror movie. And I remember not being scared by that, quite the contrary. I was like super inspired by it because it was so different from anything that I'd seen up to that point. I remember talking about it nonstop to my parents, and my mom saying like, okay, well, you've seen a horror film, but I still think you're too young to watch more. And I was like, but I want to see more. And she was like, no, not yet. So I stuck with mysteries and thrillers and suspense to sort of like as a way as well to prove my parents that I was not scared and that I did not scare easily, and hoping they would eventually let me watch more horror stuff. I was one of those kids who was really fascinated by horror, and I really wanted to watch horror films, except that my parents often would not let me. So like we'd go to the video store and I would like, you know, just go into the horror section and then look at all the box art and then like show it to my parents and be like, that's what I want to rent. And my parents would be like, no, that's not for you, you're too young for that. I was like, oh, but like I really want to. And my mom was like, can't you just be into like Disney and like kids stuff, you know? So so like I don't know why, and I don't know where that fascination comes from, but I just really liked creepy imagery. When I saw Beetlejuice on TV, I loved it so much because I responded to the aesthetic, and that to me was like, okay, this is me. This is what I love. Same with the Addams Family and the Addams Family values, and that to me was like, okay, I want to be that. Like I want to be one of the Addams Family. So I think I always responded to a sort of like horror-ish creepy aesthetic, but I didn't start watching horror movies until much later. My gateway into horror was through literature. When I was in elementary school, there was a series of horror books that came out as French translations. Everybody was so obsessed with those. Like it was nearly impossible to check them out of the school library because they were always gone. Like there was like literally a wait list for those books. Obviously, I was really into those and I really wanted to read them. I was on the wait list, but the wait list like seemed to go on forever. But I was obsessed with one of them in particular, and my parents were planning a trip to Florida for spring break, so I figured like that's a book I want to read during my trip. Because, yeah, most kids would be like, hey, go on the beach, play in the sun and in the sand. And I was like, I was the kind of kid, like a total nerd, but be like, I just want to sit under a big umbrella in the shade and like read a book, you know, and I wanted to read that specific book. There was like no way I could like check it out of the school library in time for the trip. I convinced my mom to buy it for me. So we went to the local bookstore, and I remember her talking to the clerk there and asking her like, is it really that scary? Like, you know, I just don't want my kid to be traumatized. And then the clerk was like, no, don't worry about it. Like, you know, it's like just like, you know, creepy creaking sounds that people hear, and it's like there's nothing like, you know, that traumatizing in it. So she finally agreed and she bought it for me, and this was, yeah, I still have it. I actually still have the whole entire collection. This was my gateway book. The original title is Prom Dress, written by Lil Litke, I can't pronounce it. This was published in 1991. It's about a killer prom dress, or I don't quite remember, like I haven't read it since, but all I remember is that it's a cursed dress that when people wear it, like horrible things happen to them. There's a little bit of a parallel to be drawn with the Poltergeist 3, where it's like, that again was like what drew me to horror. I'm like, this is such a cool idea. Like, you know, a piece of garment can do bad things to you and is dangerous. So it's like, whoa, like mind blown. My little kid's mind blown. I was like, that's the kind of stuff that I want to, and I'm like, oh, if this is what horror is, then give me all of it. After reading that book, I started buying all of the other books from that series, and oh yeah, I'm gonna address this now on camera. I've had this argument over the years with a lot of people. All these books, this is a series, it was translated as Frisson. From what I researched, like a lot of people mistakenly think that this is the Goosebumps series, and this is not the Goosebumps series, because the Goosebumps series was also translated as another title. And from what I found, this was what was back then called the point horror series. So, and a lot of people that I know who grew up with like English as their first language don't really know point horror. So maybe correct me if I'm wrong in the comment. I sort of have a feeling point horror maybe was not such a big deal like back then, like not as big as like Goosebumps. But I know in Quebec, especially when these came out first, and they were like way more popular than the Goosebumps books. Then afterwards, the other books that I read from that series, which was a series called The Babysitter, and that series just like cemented my love for horror. Because that was actually way closer to what I heard like horror films were like. You know, I've been told by some people, because like even if I was not watching horror, I was talking about horror films to everyone that I know who was allowed to watch them, namely my cousins who were a little bit older, and they would tell me like, yeah, horror is not like what you're thinking, and I'm like, but no, but it's all about like little girls disappearing in like puddles and like killer dresses. They're like, no, it's about people killing other people. So I feel like the Babysitter like trilogy, or I think there's a fourth one, I can't remember, is closer to what horror was for most people. And I remember reading that and liking this, and I'm like, well, okay, well, apparently I don't like just the kind of weirdo branch of horror. Like, I also like the more traditional one. So this series was actually written by R.L. Stein. Anyways, the guy who wrote the Goosebumps and the Fear Streets and a lot of the point horror books as well. I was not allowed to watch horror, but I would read a lot of horror. Well, kid-friendly horror. And then one afternoon, I saw another film that would end up like scarring me for life. Or maybe not life, but I mean for a good chunk of my life. And I remember I was super excited because I realized, oh my god, this is the second horror film I'm ever watching in my life. And it just traumatized me so much. So yeah, again, a little bit embarrassing to admit, but it was child's play. To put things in perspective, I must have been like 8 years old when I saw this. And also, again, because of the nature of like cable TV, I started watching it and it was already like way into the movie, so I never saw the whole beginning part about, like, I had no idea that the doll was actually possessed by a spirit. I just thought like the doll was like a pure demonic entity that was just like killing people. randomly. I had no context that to ground it as a like this is not a normal occurrence, you know, but so yeah, that also might explain a lot of like the trauma that was associated with that film. But I remember watching it, and as I was watching it, I was not scared of it. Like, even my grandma, I remember her, like, she was, like, sort of watching it at the same time as me, as, like, you know, yeah, I'm doing the motion, like, as she was, like, ironing. So, and, like, she would ask me, she's like, are you sure, like, are you scared? Like, you know, I was like, no, I'm not. And she's like, are you sure you're not scared? And I'm like, because I think she was realizing what was going on and what I was watching. And I'm like, no, look, I'm not scared at all. Look, like, the doll wants to kill this person and this person. And I watched the entire film. And then at first I was like, I was not scared. The film ended and I'm like, oh, that's good. So yay, I saw my second horror movie. That exact same evening, I went to the video store with my parents and I walked all over the horror section trying to find it, and I finally found a box and I showed it to my mom and I'm like, Mom, this is the movie I watched this afternoon. It's really, really good. Can we rent it? I'm sure you'd enjoy it. And she's like, yeah. She's like, you saw this? I'm like, yeah. And she's like, no. It's like, I don't think, you know, you should watch it. Like, you know, we'll rent it some other time. Like, you know. So it's like, oh, okay, fine. So like she put it back there. I think maybe I was subconsciously trying to prove myself that I was not scared. So I got back home and everything was well and I went to bed that night. And then, boom, I woke up in the middle of the night terrified. I had the most intense nightmare ever about Chucky. And I remember waking up and the first thing I saw was like this row of dolls in my room and they were all like staring at me. Because obviously I'm a little girl, like I was a little girl, so I had tons of dolls and lots of porcelain dolls. And even to this day, porcelain dolls like creep the hell out of me. But that's a story time for another day. So yeah, I wake up terrified and I'm looking for my parents and they're downstairs watching a movie. So I sneak downstairs and I go to see them and I tell my mom, like, I just had a horrible nightmare about a movie I saw today, and my mom made a face like, obviously this was bound to happen. I remember they were watching The Abyss. It was around the part where like I meet this like pinkish creature like underwater. So like I remember like being on the couch. I was like, oh, what are you watching? It's like, oh, we're watching a movie. And they seemed like kind of like not want me to stay and watch. But like I remember like I sat down on the couch with them and I saw parts of it. And like I remember like this creature and like just this overall vibe and feeling coming from the movie, thinking, oh, this is so soothing. This is reassuring to me. And there I was, like I fell in asleep in the arms of my mom while watching The Abyss and this creature that was just a soothing image. And to this day I still haven't seen the entire Abyss, but I remember that creature and I remember like good things about this. And I've been told over the years by some people that this is really truly effed up. I should do this, watch book movies and see them with my adult eyes so I can understand more about me as a child. So now, fast forward to me as a teenager. When I started high school, I honestly grew out of the point horror books and I got to the point where like I wanted to read something more, a bit more mature. So I read a Stephen King book and I just didn't think it was particularly scary back then because, I don't know, I think I didn't grasp a lot of like the concepts of like what makes it scary, and I think I was more like head on in terms of like what was terrifying or like what was supposed to be scary and what a horror book was supposed to be. But I did fall in love with an author, Edgar Allan Poe. I know how goth of me. I'm just like a cliche. I was a 12-year-old obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe and I was like reading his short stories for school, because I remember my first Edgar Allan Poe short story that I read for school. It was called The Oval Portrait and I just fell in love with it. I even made my own short film adaptation of it, which is right here on this channel if ever you want to see. It's kind of a weird, twisted version of it. So I remember reading The Oval Portrait and then like just looking for more Edgar Allan Poe, and then I realized I'm like, oh, like I guess like gothic horror like I responded more to this like suggested aesthetic and this vibe and this like, you know, feeling of it. So I started reading a lot of Edgar Allan Poe and that's how I moved out of the like, you know, children horror literature into like more like traditional horror literature. After the Chucky incident, I remember that movie channel was always for Halloween having this like all-night horror marathon. I would take those 8 hours VHS, pop them in the VCR, start recording at 7 p.m. when that first movie would start, and then just let it run all night. So I would like end up with like 4 movies on a VHS tape and then watch them. We're talking like Pet Sematary 2, we're talking the Stephen King's adaptation, like, you know, stuff like Sleepwalkers and Sometimes They Come Back, one of the horrible Halloween sequels, like I can't remember which one. I think it was like 6 or 7, I'm not sure. I would watch those horror movies, but I was not like a super avid watcher yet. Like I would like, you know, kind of get my hands on whatever I could find and then watch it casually and be like, oh, that's cool. Then at some point, I snuck into the movie theater to go watch the original Scream when it came out. And my mind was blown. I was like, oh, finally there it is, you know? And it was like, that's the first film that as a teenager made me fall in love again with horror. When I saw this, it was like a revelation. I was like, that's it. This is who I want to be. Like, I want to be one of those teenagers who's completely obsessed with horror and who knows everything about the genre. So that movie inspired me to just go into my video store and then try to rent every single horror movie that was there. I started having like horror movies, watch parties with my friends, a lot of whom actually did not like horror films and were scared of them, but I kind of like, you know, sat them down and forced them to watch them until they loved them, and eventually they did. They started liking them, and then that became our thing. We'd have like these horror movie watch parties where we'd rent like 3 or 4 VHS and then just like watch them on and on and on and on. And then just try to work our way through the entire selection of our local video store. So I spent most of my teenage years just watching everything I could get my hands on. And my love of horror shifted in terms of like the subgenres that I liked. Whereas like when I was a kid, I responded so much more to the crazy imaginative type of plots. And as a teenager, I found myself responding way more strongly to slasher films and vampire movies. But yeah, that was the heydays of like golden age, I guess, of vampire movies in the 90s. So. But yeah, mostly like just really enjoying slashers a lot. So like, you know, just really, I schooled myself with a lot of the slasher films. And yeah, so that was basically, I guess, my teenage years. And this is also during this time that my love and passion for cinema grew, and that I decided that I wanted to become a filmmaker. Ironically enough, when I started making films, it actually took years before I first like tried making a horror short. I could just go on another huge tangent, but I'm just gonna keep it for another vlog. So yeah, a very long vlog and a very long stories with lots of tangents to say this is where my love and inspiration of horror comes from. So I hope I've answered the question very well. If you would like me to talk about something else, please write it down in the comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you for watching me, and hopefully I'll see you soon for another vlog. Bye!